Welcome to the Mormon Church's Houses of Prostitution, 1885 to 1941 video. Okay, let's go over a few preliminary statements by some Mormon general authorities. This one is the Apostle and in the First Presidency, Jedediah M. Grant in 1856, so pretty early on when the Mormons came into the Utah Territory. Jedediah says, "We have a few whoremasters here. Do you wish to know who they are? I can tell the first letters of their name, and I can tell where they have been practicing their abominations in this city," Salt Lake City. "And even some who profess to be Mormons are guilty of enticing and leading girls to prostitution, saying, if you want a new dress, you can get it very easily." So here, Jedediah M. Grant saying they do have prostitution in Utah as early as 1856. Some other general authorities are going to contradict this. All right, Jedediah M. Grant continues. He was a big proponent of blood atonement. And of course, prostitution, one of those things that if you do, or if you're involved in, you're going to have to be blood atoned. Jedediah says, "I have a gun and swords in good order, and powder and lead, and am ready and able to make holes through such miserable corrupting rascals," those involved in prostitution. "These characters take Mormon girls and debauch them, telling them that the United States will send their troops here, and that this people will be broken up and driven." All right, Orson F. Whitney contradicts this statement from Jedediah in his History of the Church, 1893, but he's talking about 1867 in the Utah Territory, and he says, "As the fruit of plural marriages, we have enjoyed an unexampled immunity from the vices of prostitution." So he was saying Utah Territory, not much prostitution at all. Okay, a little statement from the Apostle Orson Pratt in 1869. "This law of monogamy, or the monogamic system, laid the foundation for prostitution." So plural marriage stops prostitution, monogamy causes prostitution, according to these Mormon leaders. So monogamy laid the foundation for prostitution and the evils and diseases of the most revolting nature and character under which modern Christendom groans. All right, the prophet Brigham Young agrees with Orson. In 1865, he said, "This monogamic system, which now prevails throughout Christendom, and which had been so fruitful a source of prostitution and whoredom throughout all the Christian monogamic cities of the Old and the New World." Pictured above, Brigham Young through some AI art. There's going to be a lot of AI art throughout this video. The first time I've used it in my videos. It's pretty cool. Sometimes I might mention what's AI and sometimes not. And you can have a little game, play a little game here and try to figure out which ones are and which ones aren't. All right, a little statement from the 70 J. Golden Kimball, 1896 speech. This is recorded or talked about in Levi J. Taylor's diary in 1896. Kimball says, "There are 500 girls who are public prostitutes in Salt Lake City." 1896, 500 of them. "Some of these are daughters of Latter-day Saints." All right, a couple of preliminary statements from the historian Jeffrey Nichols. He is the expert on this subject, and I did use his book quite a bit for this video, along with a lot of other sources and books. But he's kind of the expert. His book is called Prostitution, Polygamy and Power, Salt Lake City, 1847 to 1918. Came out in 2002, so it's kind of old. What is that, 22 years old. But still a very good book and valuable. Nichols, pictured above, he says, I found in Salt Lake City that prostitution was well known, openly regulated, and important to the growth of communities. So, a lot of prostitution in Salt Lake, openly regulated. Yeah, there were laws on the book prohibiting it, but Utah, and who is run by Mormons, decided to go down that path of regulation rather than complete abolishment of all prostitute, which is probably impossible to do anyway. And he also says it's important to the growth of communities. It was a big moneymaker, a big economic driver, so that's why the church participated in it, which we're going to get to. All right, Nichols continues. Prostitution also had a powerful economic constituency of Gentiles and Mormons who rented, sold, or leased rooms to prostitutes. And this is how the Mormons and even the Mormon general authorities participated in this through owning property and renting it and leasing it to houses of prostitution. All right, Nichols continues. The regulation of prostitution in Salt Lake City began under all Mormon rule and continued without effective challenge until the campaign against the Stockade. So, all Mormon rule, they're pretty much running this town. They're pretty much running the police, which we'll get to. And we'll get to, towards the end of the video, or the last third of the video, what the Stockade was in Salt Lake City. Okay, another source is from the BYU professors Thomas G. Alexander and James B. Allen. Did a book called Mormons and Gentiles, A History of Salt Lake City, 1984. Looks like a pretty good book from what I read. They say around this time, which was around 1858, prostitution and gambling were also prohibited in the city of Salt Lake, and the laws against them became especially pointed after the first army troops arrived. Yeah, laws. But did the Mormons really follow the laws? All right, so like with a lot of things, it's all about the money. This is Salt Lake Herald Republican newspaper, 1875. Justice Clinton told Kate Flint, who ran a house of prostitution, that so long as she paid the fines, she might run her house of prostitution, but when she refused to pay, his boys would do her great injury. So if these houses of prostitution and these prostitutes are paying their fines to the city, they're kind of left alone, right? Even though it's against the law, because they were paying exorbitant fines, and we'll get to how much they are, which was a lot of money for the city. Okay, another book by journalist and author Eileen Hallett Stone, Selling Sex in Utah, A History of Vice, 2023. This is not really a history book, it just has mostly stories about different madams and prostitutes. She says several days earlier, Miss Flint had paid a $100 fine. Big fine. She offered $50 and after thinking it over, questioned the number of charges that she had taken care of. She asked for a receipt about which the paper reported that he said if he gave her one, he would be put out of office. So big fines and kind of under the table, right? They're not keeping receipts, not keeping records of these things. $100 back in this time was a lot of money. If you calculate for inflation, that would be worth $3,600 in 2024 for one fine. So I don't know how often they were paying these fines, but periodically they would have to pay these $50 fines or $100 fines. And then, they'd be basically left alone. Okay, the Salt Lake City Daily Tribune talked about this in 1885. The Madams Flint, Davis, DeMar, Lawrence, Noble, and Gray were fined $99 each for keeping houses of prostitution. Of the 24 inmates, or the prostitutes who worked there, of the houses of ill fame, or the houses of prostitution, 15 of these were fined $50 each. Big fines and a lot of money going back and forth here. All right, so there's very little evidence that Brigham Young was running a house of prostitution or renting a building that the church owned two houses of prostitution. This is one source. It's probably not that good of a source, but I put it in here because it's interesting. This was in the Corinne Journal Reporter in 1872. The chief manager of prostitution, who was Brigham Young, stood looking on, grandly exempt from the havoc touching the many stinking brothels over which he is ruler. The sins of Commercial Street, where the property was destroyed, that's Kate Flint's place, or her house of prostitution. They destroyed it for some reason. These are classed as nuisances, while the houses of ill fame supported by the prophet and his lecherous priests are safe for the present. Okay, there's only one other source that talks about Brigham Young running a whorehouse. This is from Anne Gorge Lee, her autobiography, two variants of it, 1900 and 1915. This is not a very good source either. She is full of tall tales. She tells a lot of things that don't add up with other reliable history. And this is from Jeff Nichols, who we already talked about, who wrote, the best book on this, and also Will Bagley. So historians that I definitely trust. But this is still interesting, even though it's not a good source and probably not true. The year that I and Gorge left Salt Lake City, Brigham Young was running a percentage whorehouse in the city. He would go around every morning and collect his percentage with the regularity of clockwork, and pictured above. All right, Anne Gorge Lee continues, another picture of her above. Kate Flint came with General Connor's army, and she started a first-class sporting house, which is a name for a house of prostitution. Brigham Young did not like the opposition and concluded that he would break it up. Maybe that was what the other sources that we read were talking about. Maybe that's why Brigham broke it up. But like I said, this is not a reliable source. He would break it up as it interfered very materially with his own business. Okay, Salt Lake Tribune, 1872, also talks about Kate Flint. Does making prostitution a source of revenue tend to its overflow to accept from the fallen woman, Kate Flint, her ill-gotten gains? It looks more like pandering to prostitution for the sake of its spoils than a disposition to suppress it. Pictured above, these are real prostitutes here. Okay, Salt Lake Tribune also talks about Kate Flint in 1872. The wanton and malicious destruction of the frail ones of Commercial Street, that's Kate Flint, was a riotous proceeding that violated the laws of the United States, not prompted out of the desire for producing a better state of morals in the city, but simply out of revenge at not being able to control the entire earnings of the women from their life of shame. So yeah, there's a lot of money coming in. Other people want to control it, right? Madams want to control it. The city wants to control it. And yeah, even the church wants to control it. All right, so somebody destroyed Kate Flint's original house of prostitution. Could be competitors, could be Brigham Young, could be the city. I don't know. This is another source. Journalist and author Eileen Hallett Stone. Oh, we already mentioned her. Selling Sex in Utah again. 2023. She says, in 1880, Kate opened a new brothel near East 200 South Street on Victoria Place. Pictured above, there's a map of Victoria Place red light district of kind of what it looked like. All right, another source, journalist Christy Carras, More Than Petticoats, Remarkable Utah Women, 2010. In Salt Lake City, by the 1870s, houses of prostitution were generally on the inside of city blocks, kind of hidden away, where they couldn't be easily seen. All right, Christie continues. Many of these houses were downtown along Commercial Street, now called Regent Street in Salt Lake currently, a half block east of Main Street, and this is an actual picture of Commercial Street at the time. Okay, back to Alexander and Allen. They say that prostitution was centered around what is now Regent Street, then called Commercial Street, which we already mentioned. It was also on Franklin Avenue, now it is called Edison Street, and Victoria Alley, a block south of Commercial Street, where houses of prostitution and opium dens existed. There was also Plum Alley. So these were all of the streets and areas where prostitution was happening at this time. And there's a picture of Plum Alley around this time. All right. According to the Salt Lake Tribune, in 1897, most of the prostitution was around Franklin Avenue, or before 1897, and then after 1897, it got moved over to Commercial Street. This is Salt Lake Tribune, 1908. 11 years ago, 1897, the red light district of Salt Lake was removed from Franklin Avenue to the present district of Commercial Street. And here's a current business, I think, on Franklin Avenue, Cocktails and Kitchen. All right, Alexander and Allen, in their book, Mormons and Gentiles, Commercial Street remained the city's red light district until the late 1930s. And guess what? Mormon Church owned a bunch of property on Commercial Street. All right, Alexander and Allen again. Alexander pictured above. A study in 1880 estimated that Salt Lake City had 5 houses of prostitution, and estimates in the early 1890s placed the figure near 35. That's a lot. 35 houses of prostitution. All right, Allen pictured above. These were subjected to periodic raids by the city police department, largely for the purpose of control and raising revenue. And the Mormon Church pretty much ran the police, or had a lot of influence in the police department. Pretty much all the police officers were Mormon, which we'll get to. But why do they do it? Raising revenue. All right, now we get to a very interesting story. This was a spy ring, probably conducted by the church, at least by church members, trying to blackmail federal and state authorities who were clamping down on the practice of polygamy. So this is from Stephen Creswell. He did an article called "The U.S. Department of Justice in Utah Territory, 1870 to 1890, Utah Historical Quarterly," 1985 came out. He says, in 1885, during the tenure of U.S. Attorneys W.H. Dixon and C.S. Varian, members of the Salt Lake City Police Force and other prominent Mormons initiated an undercover operation hoping to induce federal officials to commit crimes of lust, trap them and blackmail them with prostitutes. Pictured above, I believe that is actual Salt Lake City police around this time. Okay, so a special brothel was actually opened in the city. This by Mormons or prominent Mormons, or even the church. We're not 100% sure. But it sounds like it probably was from the church, which we'll get more into. But Stephen Creswell continues, a brothel was opened in the city with secret compartments for observation provided, and prostitutes were imported. All right, Stephen continues, members of the police department, while off duty, took turns watching at the peepholes while the madam sent enticing notes to federal office holders. Here's another picture of police at the time frame looking through a kind of a portal or peephole. This is an AI picture. All right, same source here. The most important of the men thus captured was Assistant U.S. Attorney S.H. Lewis. He was tried for lewd and lascivious conduct before a justice of the peace. He was found guilty. He took an appeal to the 3rd District Court as permitted by statute. Another AI art above. All right, so why were they doing this? Well, it all had to do with polygamy. Stephen continues, the motivations of the Mormons in the case was clear. The national press was full of talk about Mormon lust and licentiousness. The plan here was to show that the very men who were prosecuting polygamists were clearly guilty of their own kind of lasciviousness. Okay, but before the 3rd District Court, C.S. Varian defended his colleague and attacked the Mormon witnesses. I do not believe any American jury would believe such infamous scoundrels who have crawled into the threshold of the house of the harlot. All right, Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Utah Territory, C.S. Varian, he did a report of the grand jury for the 3rd Judicial District in December of 1885. Very interesting report from Varian here. We're going to read a big chunk of it. Certain prominent and influential Mormon citizens of Salt Lake City, and this is his own language, conceived the idea of opening houses of ill fame in certain localities of the municipality for the purpose of enticing prominent government officials. They actually opened up these things. And they wanted to entice others into the commission of offenses as well, in order that they might be detected and publicity be given to their crimes. This was all to divert attention away from polygamy problems. Trapping, blackmailing. All right, Varian continues, Assistant U.S. Attorney. Sometime in April or May of last 1885, an officer of the city government, not connected with the police, with others unknown at present to the grand jury, entered into a conspiracy to open houses of assignation and ill fame within the city limits, for the avowed purpose of entrapping weak and vicious people into the commission of offenses against chastity and morality, in order that all such might be exposed and punished in the courts. All right, C.S. Varian continues. This scheme involved the renting and fitting up of houses for this purpose, the employment of public and private prostitutes, the conversion of the police bureau into a nest of spotters and spies. Apparently they did this in their off hours. And the expenditure of a large sum of money. It's a pretty big spy ring here. Okay, same source. For years, there have been well-known houses of prostitution in Salt Lake which have been under police surveillance and at stated periods have contributed materially to the revenues of the municipality. Okay, by the evidence before us, the plan was conceived and carried into effect with a design of using the criminal law as a snare for the weak and immoral, and with the object, in part at least, of creating a great public scandal. Okay, C.S. Varian continues. Houses were rented and furnished on West Temple Street, and women placed in possession thereof, and every member of the police force of Salt Lake City, with two honorable exceptions, volunteered his services as a spy and informer in aid of the conspiracy. Okay, a little bit of information from Jeffrey Nichols. He says Brigham Young Hampton, pictured above, hired two women, Fanny Davenport and S.J. Fields, and set them up in houses on West Temple Street, from which they attempted to attract the targeted customers. All right, a different source here. Herbert Lester Gleason in a master's thesis, University of Utah, on the Salt Lake City Police Department. He says the police force that would go on to make arrests was all Mormon. Police was all Mormon. Okay, back to C.S. Varian. The women were hired to perform their parts, and their exertions stimulated by the promise of exorbitant sums for their success in entrapping high officials. One of these creatures was promised $1,000, a lot of money, in the event of her being able to draw the governor of the territory, Eli Houston Murray, into her toils. So I guess he wasn't a friend of the Mormons at the time. Murray, pictured above. Okay, in the course of their operations, these women conveyed notes of invitation to many prominent officials and citizens, requesting interviews on business at the places designated. All right, one of these women was paid $300 or $400, and the other $700 for her services. This is a lot of money at this time. When the women were safe out of the territory, complaints were filed, warrants were issued, and arrests were made, and the community was thrown into a state of excitement and alarm. All right, the money employed in this scheme, we are told by its prime mover, was paid by one of the high officials of Salt Lake City. At the time, the prophet was John Taylor, George Buchanan, and Joseph F. Smith were his counselors. Dare we say that maybe they contributed some money or some influence in this spy campaign? Okay, Varian continues. It is claimed that the money was raised by private subscription. We have been unable to ascertain that any part of it came from the public treasury. So it probably came from church sources or private sources. Okay, some information from Nichols. He says that Francis Armstrong, a Mormon merchant and city selectman, testified that he provided $500 of his own money to bankroll Hampton. 500 is a lot of money. That could just be one source, and there might be others. I don't know. Francis Armstrong, pictured above. All right, some information from Brigham Young Hampton's journal. About the 1st of May, 1885, Francis Armstrong, chairman of the said committee, the spy ring committee, I guess, of which I, Brigham Young Hampton, was a member, Armstrong asked me if I could detect the government officials and others in their whoredoms and adultery and bring them to justice if the money was furnished to do the work. So here's another source saying that Armstrong probably gave Hampton that money. And also Hampton said that other people on the committee were William Salmon and Andrew Smith. Not sure who those were. But Brigham Young Hampton was also friends with some of the general authorities of the church. This is also from his journal, December 20, 1887 entry. President of the 12, Wilford Woodruff, the Apostle George Buchanan, and Apostle Joseph F. Smith came to my house. We gave them the use of 2 bedrooms, parlor, and a dining room. This is just to show that there was connections there with higher up general authorities. All right, back to Varian. He says basically the mayor, the chief of police, and other city officials had no idea about the spy ring. Makes me think it was a church function, right? So none of them knew about it, except as herein stated. So far as we can learn, none were advised of the proceeding until the plot was ripe. All right, all of the police officers engaged in it, the spy ring, it is claimed, performed the services required when off duty. And remember, they're all Mormon. One of them states that his services were rendered for the good of the cause, right? For polygamy. Get these guys, these government officials, off their backs about polygamy. Okay, more from the Brigham Young Hampton Journal. We had about 25 men employed without pay. Sounds like the church, right? Volunteer work. It consisted of home missionaries. Home missionaries, that's definitely church language, right? Kind of like on missions, I guess, to, special mission. Home missionaries to do the spiring. And others, including the entire police force, with the exception of 2, and the marshal who knew nothing of what was going on. All right, Assistant U.S. Attorney Varian continues. It is stated in the history that a very large number of arrests were made by the police for offenses charged to have been committed within the houses referred to in the grand jury report, and that upon their reaching the district court, all of them were dismissed by the prosecuting officer, and a criticism is based thereon. So all these government officials they kind of brought along and charged and arrested. It sounds like all these cases were dismissed after they found out that it was aspiring. All right, Varian continues, and here's where he says that the whole thing was motivated about polygamy and unlawful cohabitation. The thought underlying this conspiracy was based upon a conception that if Gentiles and strangers to the Mormon people were guilty of offenses against law and morals, that such fact would be evidence of unfairness in prosecution for violation of the laws of the United States against polygamy and unlawful cohabitation. Pictured above a dude with 2 of his wives in Utah, I guess. That's AI. It's amazing how good it is. Okay, the Mormon historian B.H. Roberts knew about this, probably following it in the papers, and he wrote about it in his Comprehensive History of the Church, Volume 6. Another regrettable thing done on the part of the Latter-day Saints, and growing out of the sense of unfairness attending upon the administration of the federal laws by the federal officials, led some overzealous men, officers of the city government, then entirely in Mormon hands. So he's kind of admitting this was done by the Mormons, and who knows how high up it went. But some overzealous men, some officers of the city government, then entirely in Mormon hands, to arrange by a system of secret espionage on such characters in the city as resorted to places of prostitution, and by prosecution of them make at least public exposure of their crimes. Roberts pictured above. All right, Roberts continues. It was believed that many prominent in prosecutions of polygamy and unlawful cohabitation cases would be entrapped. So, yeah, that's the purpose of it. All right, Roberts continues. Great consternation prevailed in certain quarters. Many vague rumors were afloat as to a list of from 400 to 600 offenders. Jeez, that's a lot. I think that's a high number. 400 to 600 offenders being in the hands of the city officers, and there were more blanched cheeks, embarrassed, and shaking knees than Salt Lake has ever before contained, notwithstanding the assertion regarding the anti-Mormon purity. All right, back to Jeffrey Nichols. He says, altogether, Hampton claimed to have caught about 100 men, including several government officials, but the larger fish avoided the bait. So I guess that would be the governor and some of the judges. They avoided the bait. So this is according to Hampton. That's probably more accurate than B.H. Roberts. All right. The Daily Tribune talked about this whole scandal. November 26, 1885. The non-Mormon Daily Tribune said that Salt Lake now enjoys the distinction of being the only city in the world in which houses of prostitution were established by the city authorities. The only city that ever hired its official prostitutes and paid them a premium for every man that they enticed. This city also has the only newspapers in the world that are vile enough to defend such infamy. And they're talking about the Deseret News. Pictured above, some prostitutes of the time period. And that is AI. Hard to tell. All right. So on December 2nd, 1885, the church's Deseret News called the police conspiracy a good work. Hard to believe that a regular newspaper would call it a good work. Let the work of cleansing go on and be made thorough. We want the help of the Lord and the power of his might. We hope the police will go on with their good work, no matter where the fur flies. The church will not flinch at the exposure of the hypocrites. So you can see here, Deseret News, owned by the church. General authorities probably have a lot to say of what goes into the Deseret News. They're totally supporting this whole spy ring. Okay, another article in the Daily Tribune, November 24th, 1885. Circumstances are rapidly coming to light which show conclusively that several assignation houses have been opened and conducted with the money of the church or of the city. Assignation house, just a house of prostitution. It is believed with good reason that the prostitutes of these houses, as well as Mormon girls of loose character, were in the employ of the police. Mormon church pretty much running the police too. Who were either admitted to the houses and allowed to watch proceedings, this is the police, or were given the dates upon which certain individuals visited them. All right, back to historian Jeffrey Nichols and his book, Prostitution, Polygamy, and Power. Although the Tribune insisted that LDS church authorities must have directed and financed the assignation fiends, the grand jury found no evidence to support the claim. Well, maybe they just didn't have the evidence. Okay, another Daily Tribune article, November 25th, 1885. It is a church matter. Every policeman who stands ready to swear, who has kept watch in secret with prostitutes, every man who has been engaged in the business in any way, except for one Hebrew agent who acted under orders from a big Mormon, pays 1/10 of his salary to our holy church. So they're all, basically he's saying they're all Mormons except this one Hebrew guy. They all pay their tithing. Okay, same article here in the Daily Tribune. Says that they went to San Francisco and Denver to get more prostitutes for this whole scheme. When the country understands that the emissaries of the church went to San Francisco and Denver and hired prostitutes to come here to decoy men, the question will be, what kind of a thing is it which in the name of a church stoops to the use of such instruments as those? This doesn't seem like the kind of stuff that a church would be doing, right? Okay, Daily Tribune, November 27, 1885. It has been made clear that to execute a revenge upon certain men, the Mormon Church, through the city authorities, who are but creatures of the church, and who do nothing except through the advice and consent of the chiefs of the church, they're kind of in charge of the city authorities and the police, right? Entered into contracts with common prostitutes, paying them large sums and furnishing them with means to rent houses, over which they further extended the protection of the police, and from which they withdrew all the restrictions. They withdrew all the restrictions which attach to ordinary houses of ill fame. Okay, back to Nichols. He says that Judge Zane dismissed the remaining cases, and he also dismissed the case against U.S. Deputy Marshal Oscar Vandercook, pictured above. All right, Nichols again. He just says the same thing again. Judge Zane dismissed the cases and directed the grand jury to prosecute all keepers of houses of ill fame. So here we have basically the church and Mormons keeping a house of ill fame. They're the ones that got prosecuted in this. All right, Nichols continues. The grand jury reported that the police could not or would not provide sufficient information to indict any keepers other than Fields, Davenport, and Hampton. So if the police were withholding information about this kind of stuff, they could easily withhold information about higher-ups in the church being involved in this. All right, here's some information from church historian Andrew Jensen, Church Chronology 1886. Thursday the 24th, after 3 days' trial, the jury in the 3rd District Court brought in a verdict of guilty against Brigham Y. Hampton for the conspiracy. Because he organized a lot of it, right? So he got charged and was guilty. And then on Wednesday the 30th, in the 3rd District Court, Judge Zane sentenced Brigham Young Hampton to 1 year's imprisonment in the Salt Lake County Jail. So he got a year for it. Hampton was the collector of license and a member of the church and a former police officer, I believe. All right, Brigham Young Hampton's diary. Interesting diary. Hampton claimed to have caught about 100 men, including several government officials and men in high standing in the community, all bitter enemies of the saints and opposed to plural marriage as practiced by the servants of God, although the women failed to entice the federal judges or the governor. Hampton writes that the witnesses were home missionaries and city policemen who were all Mormons. Okay, some more information from Nichols. The Tribune noted that Francis Armstrong, the financier, was to be the next Salt Lake City mayor. So he did okay for himself. With Alfred Salomon, his city marshal. Salomon was one of those police officers that was peering through the knot holes. All right, kind of a closing statement from the Tanners, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, in their book Mormon Spies, Hughes and the CIA, 1976. I believe they put most of this information in the Shadow or Reality book as well. They're pictured above, so that they say, how much the Mormon leaders knew about the conspiracy before it came to light is difficult to say, but they certainly gave full support to it when it was revealed. As we have shown, the church's own Deseret News claimed that the conspiracy was a good work. Okay, kind of a final statement by Jeffrey Nichols. The episode certainly proved damaging to the saints' credibility. Anti-Mormons could now point to the incident as proof that the LDS Church had operated brothels. All right, final statement by journalist Christy Carras, kind of associated with this indirectly. She says, all kinds of men, including powerful ones, frequented brothels. That gave madams an unusual degree of access and even influence. They could blackmail certain people if they had to. All right, let's go on to another topic. This is very interesting. This is fascinating to me. Pointed out by the Mormon historian D. Michael Quinn in his book Same-Sex Dynamics, a Mormon Example, 1996. Came out quite a while ago. He did a lot of amazing, really detailed research for that book, and this is one of the topics in there. Also, we will use the Brigham Young Hampton Journal to point out a lot of this. So Quinn says, a little known irony is that the LDS Church had a long-term relationship with several of Salt Lake City's houses of prostitution on Commercial Street, downtown Salt Lake, since 1891. All right, Quinn continues. According to Hampton's account in his journal, he had protested about these leases, but had been brushed off by the officers of the Brigham Young Trust Company, and I'll tell you who those are. They're general authorities. Pictured above is Hampton. All right, so what was this Brigham Young Trust Company? Well, Quinn tells us in his book, The Mormon Hierarchy, Wealth, and Corporate Power 2017, the latest in the trilogy. He says the Brigham Young Trust Company was a real estate company, a holding company for LDS properties. Notice that, a holding company for LDS properties. That's pretty closely associated with the church, right? President of this company was George Q. Cannon, an apostle and in the First Presidency for a long time. Vice President Brigham Young Jr., the son of Brigham Young and also an apostle. Trustees John W. Young, Joseph F. Smith, and John Q. Cannon are trustees. Of course, Joseph F. Smith was an apostle and went on to become the president. General authority stockholder at death, Abraham H. Cannon with 50 shares. What else here? Nephi W. Clayton, principal stockholder, September 1901. And then this company was succeeded by Clayton Investment Company, which also held owned these properties and leased these properties to houses of prostitution. And here's the cover of that book, Wealth and Corporate Power. This came out before the big whistleblower case blew the doors off of Ensign Peak advisors, showing that they had over $100 billion in liquid investments, basically, in the church. All right, back to same-sex dynamics, one of the covers above. When Judge Charles S. Zane in 1891 threatened to prosecute the owners of houses of prostitution, the officers of the Brigham Young Trust Company decided to make Hampton the scapegoat, Brigham Young Hampton. He was a scapegoat due to his previous conviction in 1885 for operating a Mormon spy ring in a Salt Lake City house of prostitution for the purpose of entrapping federal officials with prostitutes. And we've gone over all that previously. All right, here's another source for this. Historians Polly Aird, Jeff Nichols again, and Will Bagley, editors of A Kingdom in the West, Volume 13, Playing with Shadows, Voices of Dissent in the Mormon West, 2011. Also talks about this, and then it also has a big chunk of Brigham Young Hampton's journal in there. I'm not sure if it's the whole thing. So they say Hampton's long 1890 to 1891 diary entries are headlined Brigham Young Trust Company's record of their making me their scapegoat. Here, once again, Brigham Young Hampton found himself facing prison time for running a house of prostitution. Okay, same source here, Aird, Nichols, and Bagley. The Brigham Young Trust Company, whose officers included high-ranking officials in the LDS Church, owned the building in question that had this house of prostitution in it, right? So yeah, I already told you who the officials were from the LDS Church in the Brigham Young Trust Company. This is the actual building here. On the first couple floors, I think there's just regular businesses, Brigham Young Trust Company businesses or business. The top floor here was the house of prostitution. A big chunk of that very top floor in a church-owned building was this very large and profitable brothel. Okay, same source, Bagley pictured above. Hampton became convinced that they were willing to sacrifice him to the legal authorities while they profited from illegal activities on their property and soiled the late prophet Brigham Young's good name. All right, here's another picture of that Brigham Young Trust Company. Again, top floor, house of prostitution. Historian Jeffrey Nichols has some more details here in his book, Prostitution, Polygamy, and Power. Brigham Young Hampton erected a building on Commercial Street on land leased from the Brigham Young estate. So I guess it was this building. Hampton claimed that the officers of the Brigham Young Trust Company, now managing parts of the estate, decided to sacrifice him to the authorities. Okay, Nichols continues, such property owners often wielded substantial social, political, and economic power. Yes, Mormon Church. The company's ownership of this building did not become a matter of public comment at this time, but brothels became a public issue and a matter of contention within the company in the coming years. All right, so it wasn't just the houses of prostitution that made a lot of money. It was all the businesses around them. It was kind of a district regulated in Salt Lake City. And oftentimes the same owners would own, liquor stores or saloons or restaurants, the same owners that own the houses of prostitution. So it's like this whole big area, this whole big street. So Nichols says within the district itself, prostitution and its allied businesses, saloons, restaurants, stores, boarding houses, often earned healthy profits. All right, Nichols continues here. He talks about how these houses of prostitution would be charged higher rent because they had more money. And the Brigham Young Trust Company, aka the church, knew about this, of course. And they knew they could charge them higher rent. So this is what Nichols says. Landlords and merchants often charged prostitutes higher rents and prices than they did other citizens. Cora Conway testified, I think she was a madam, she testified that merchants charged us women more than they do anybody else. They charge us two prices. They make us pay more than they do anybody else, and everybody knows that. The church took advantage of this. All right, journalist Harold Schindler talked about this in the Salt Lake Tribune, later published in a book called In Another Time, Sketches of Utah History. He says, it was well known that no class of tenant paid a higher rental than prostitutes. All right, so George Q. Cannon basically admitted that Hampton was the scapegoat. There's other places that you might see this denied, but this is a letter from the apostle, and in the First Presidency, George Q. Cannon, President's Office to Brigham Young Hampton, November 1886. Of course, Cannon pictured above. So he tells Hampton, it seems that you are a scapegoat to bear and carry off the sins and burdens of others in your attempt to show up the corruptions of those who have been howling against the Mormons. That was the whole spy ring. You have fallen a victim and have had to bear the brunt of their assaults. All right, let's go back to Quinn and same-sex dynamics. Here's the other cover of it. There's two covers. Hampton was indicted on November 15, 1891 for operating a house of prostitution, but the charges were dropped on March 26 as evidence of the truthfulness of Hampton's statements, which we'll get to in his journal. His truthfulness about these operations. The First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 agreed on June 14, 1900, to pay Hampton $3,600 for his previous work in the house of prostitution. All right, Quinn continues. Some more AI art above. Hampton originally presented his claim for his detective work on November 7, 1900, the same day that the First Presidency and Apostles discussed the situation of LDS leased houses of prostitution. So they knew about it. They were discussing it. All right, same source, Quinn, but also documented in Brigham Young Jr.'s diary, January 15 and 21st, 1897 entries. Here's another picture of that Brigham Young Trust Company building in some different light. Kind of hard to tell what color it was in these black and white pictures, but anyway, Quinn says all this created conflict within the Mormon hierarchy because the Brigham Young Trust Company's officers had elected to lease buildings to whores. That's according to Brigham Young Jr., I think. Apostle Brigham Young Jr. angrily resigned in January 1897 as vice president of this LDS company that bore his father's name. All right, let's go over statements in Brigham Young Hampton's journal. Like I said, this journal can be found in that other book, Kingdoms of the West book. It's also in the Church History Library, but it's in cursive, super hard to read. Anyway, in the latter part of 1891, Judge Zane instructed the grand jury to indict all persons renting houses for purposes of prostitution. All right, Hampton continues in his journal. This scared the Brigham Young Trust Company, which was composed mostly of the heirs of President Young, and to whom the estate had been transferred to for management, and as they had many houses occupied by prostitutes. So this wasn't the only one they had, it sounds like. They had many. Okay, he continues. There was a fear of indictment and their great respect for the good name of the late President Brigham Young, which must be protected at all hazards. Yes. Watch my video on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. That's where the line is now for the church. They have to protect his name at all hazards. All right, Hampton continues. Consequently, a meeting of the brains was called, the brains of the Brigham Young Trust Company, and plans formed for escape. And as I had been indicted and served one year in the county jail for detecting resorters to houses of ill fame, resorters are Johns, right? To houses of prostitution of ill fame, Judge Zane and District Attorney C.S. Varian, having had the honor of putting me where I could not disturb their kind, consequently I was just the scapegoat that the church or Brigham Young Trust Company wanted. He was just the scapegoat they wanted and was sacrificed for their sins in the past. All right, Hampton continues. We all believed that it was a scheme of the Brigham Young Trust Company to make a scapegoat of me to save their own honors. The church always does this too. They always make scapegoats. Look at John D. Lee in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and there's so many other instances, even going back in Joseph Smith's time. And they wanted to get possession of the property as it was bringing good rents. Yes. Okay, so he continues. As soon as my building 11, 13, and 15 on Commercial Avenue fell into their hands, Brigham Young Trust Company, it was rented to Chinamen who carry on the business of merchandising, gambling, opium dens, prostitution, and filth. This is who they're renting to, the Brigham Young Trust Company. Pictured above, an opium den created by AI. All right, another source here, Edgar E. Folk, D.D., and George A. Lofton, D.D. Doctorate of Divinity, I think. The Mormon Monster Book, or The Story of Mormonism, 1900. So, this book was put out right during this time, or right during this year. On Commercial Street in Salt Lake City is a large building with the initials over it, BYT Co., which means the Brigham Young Trust Company, property of the Brigham Young estate, of which George Buchanan is president. Yep, all true. All right, Folk and Lofton, doctors of divinity, I guess. In this building, there is a gambling saloon on one side and a house of ill fame on the other. When attention was called to these facts, the property was leased to an agent, Brigham Young Hampton. Yeah, kind of let Hampton do the dirty work, right? And Hampton sublet the building for these different purposes. All right, Folk and Lofton in The Mormon Monster, 1900. But the gambling saloon and the house of ill fame are still there. In the Whittingham block and in the Nauvoo block, both on First South Street, and both belonging to the Brigham Young Trust Company, there is a saloon in each block. So this trust company owning gambling institutions, saloons, and houses of prostitution. All right, same source here. This is an interesting statistic, if true. It is said that there are altogether, on the whole estate of Brigham Young, 14 saloons and 5 houses of prostitution. Remember what Hampton said too. There was many houses of prostitution. Okay, same source. The Valley Hotel, pictured above, was the property of President Woodruff, I guess president of the church. It has a saloon in it for many years, and since his death is still continued in the interest of the family. All right, same source. Belonging to the estate, the Brigham Young Trust Company, was a house which would rent for $25 per month, and the trustees were offering it at $75 a month for its use as a house of prostitution. They asked the heirs about it. So we already went over this. They're charging a lot more for these houses of prostitution that would normally go for $25 a month. They're giving it for $75 a month to the madams. Okay, they told the trustees that if they could rent it for any other purpose and get as much money to do so, but if not, to rent it for that purpose. It is so rented and is still being used for that purpose. So yeah, they're not going to really find anything that pays more than that. All right, Brigham Young Hampton's journal. Ada Wilson, a notorious keeper of houses of ill fame, was rented a portion of the upper part of the said building, a Brigham Young Trust Company property. Rented the upper portion, as was typical, which was fitted up to suit her fancy, so it could be run on the Parisian style, see the picture above, and it is known all over the country by traveling men and tourists as the Little Paris, though it is the biggest house of its kind west of New York. I'm not sure if that's true. Nichols says that last part is probably not true, that it's the biggest house, prostitution west of New York. But you kind of see what this Parisian style was, at least according to AI, pretty fancy. All right, Hampton continues here in his journal. How we do honor the good name of our beloved and departed President Brigham Young, and question and deplore the renting of houses for such purposes of prostitution. All right, Hampton talks about this man named Spencer Clawson, a member of the church who also had a house of prostitution. He says, during all this time and for many months before and after, the Brigham Young Trust Company raided on me. Their representative, Spencer Clawson, he's their representative. Spencer Clawson was the chairman of the executive committee, treasurer, and he was also an alternate member of the High Council of the Salt Lake Stake. So Spencer Clawson had one of the worst dives, I'm interpreting that as a house of prostitution, that one of the worst dives that has ever been in this or any other city, and had been a great source of annoyance to the city officials. All right, Hampton gives a few more details about Spencer Clawson. City Marshal Young told me that the building 62 and 62 and a half on Commercial Street was owned or managed by Spencer Clawson, and that the upper story was occupied by 3 Japanese prostitutes and 1 white woman, a snake charmer. So that's something interesting, a snake charmer. All right, so this is maybe what that snake charmer looked like. All right, Hampton continues. The ground floor of Spencer Clawson's building had 2 French women, 1 black whore, and a Chinese wash house all under one roof. I took the liberty of telling Spencer Clawson of the grand assortment and up-to-date institution that he presided over, and he made no denial. All right, Brigham Young Hampton continues. There are 21 officers and directors for the Brigham Young Trust Company appointed for 10 years, incorporated February 24th, 1891. All are relations, and in fact, 10 of them were Youngs, or heirs to Brigham Young. Anyone reading over the above names would say that it cannot be possible that such men violate the law every day by renting houses to prostitutes, gambling, rum, and Chinese in this AD 1900. But nevertheless, it is true. And here's Brigham Young above, I think, with some of his sons. Okay, the almighty dollar is above the law, and the good name of their benefactor, President Brigham Young, deceased. Okay, the Brigham Young Trust Company have rented a portion of their building on the corner of Commercial Street and Commercial Avenue to a Miss Elsie St. Omer. She was a madam. The woman that was in my house when they jumped me and held their hands up in holy horror at such thing. Okay, everything that they have falsely charged me with, they have been guilty of 100 times over. So more than one house of prostitution, right? And all they have brought upon me financially and otherwise will come home to them. Karma, I guess. All right, so here's a new source that I don't think any of the other historians have used yet because it's relatively new. The Journal of George Q. Cannon, 2018. A huge document. This is on page 5446, September 29, 1896 entry. Cannon says that this company, the Brigham Young Trust Company, has made an honest and persistent effort to redeem and improve the Commercial Street property morally and otherwise, and has succeeded in driving immoral characters from our property, which resulted in reducing our revenue, materially affecting the value of our adjacent property, like saloons and restaurants, etc., and reducing the value of our stock to such an extent that a great many of the present stockholders are threatened with the immediate loss of their shares. So they tried to do the right thing, right, and get rid of the houses of prostitution, etc., but it was at great cost. They ended up losing a lot of money, and some of the stockholders might even lose all their shares. All right, here's the cover. This was actually put out by the church. You can get it on Kindle. The Journal of George Q. Cannon, 1849 to 1901, so right in this time period. All right, what to do about losing all this money? Well, it's the same journal entry in George Q. Cannon's journals. We therefore believe that the best interests of the company will be served by leasing this property on the best terms possible, which would be to prostitutes, right? With the restrictive clauses in the present form of lease stricken out. Well, what were these restrictive clauses? Well, for a while they were basically prohibiting houses of prostitution and maybe some other things. So in other words, renters could now run houses of prostitution on company property because they're going to take that clause out. We desire to state that this conclusion has been reached after a long and careful consideration of all the circumstances surrounding the matter, and as a last resort to protect the stockholders from total loss or ruin. All right, Cannon continues. I, George Q. Cannon, am as much opposed to any relaxation in this direction as anybody can be. It is said that $10,000 can be added to the annual income of the company by changing the policy. I was utterly opposed to any change of policy because as far as I was concerned, I could get along, but maybe not others, right? And Cannon was losing a lot of money, as we're going to see. All right, Cannon continues. I said that I was not willing to hear such remarks made as would reflect upon the present Board of Trustees or on myself as president to the effect that we were going to rent property, etc., for evil purposes and that the heirs were opposed to it. He doesn't want to hear it, right? We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to criticize leaders, right? Any of the trustees. We don't criticize the Lord's anointed, right? Or himself as the president of the company. We're not going to criticize him and as an apostle and in the First Presidency. All right, Cannon says that he had to leave the meeting before it was through, but the majority supported the report of the committee. In other words, we're going to take the clause out that we can't rent for immoral purposes, take that out, and we're going to start renting to houses of prostitution because we either can't rent these buildings or we're getting a low amount of rent. All right, this whole topic was covered in the Salt Lake Tribune, January 4th, 1897. Title is Leased for Immoral Use, Commercial Street to have its old tenants, houses of prostitution. Brigham Young Trust Company changes its policy against the protest of George Buchanan. Yeah, because he was just so strong and against it, right? For some time past, a controversy has been carried on among the directors of the Brigham Young Trust Company. The question at issue was the management of the commercial street property, the company owning nearly one half of the property on that thoroughfare. So they owned one half of all this. All right, Salt Lake Tribune continues. As is well known, the street from its past denizens bears an unsavory reputation. Yeah, houses of prostitution, opium dens, liquor stores, saloons. Heretofore, all leases of the company have had a clause forbidding any building leased being used for immoral purposes. There was a clause in there. You can't lease these for immoral purposes. All right, Salt Lake Tribune continues. Leased for immoral use, January 4th, 1897 article. Now this clause will be stricken out, and no questions asked of the leasee as to the purpose to which a house will be put. So we don't ask, we don't tell, right? Some of the stockholders agree that the change is one of business only, and that they do not have to know who subleases the buildings which they have leased at a good rental for the first time. But they do know, right? All right, the Tribune continues. George Buchanan and Spencer Clayton were among those who bitterly opposed the renting of any of the buildings without the insertion of the moral clause. Well, we read about Spencer Clayton, too. He had his own house of prostitution. So his opinion's kind of tainted. And at one of the directors' meetings, Mr. Cannon, it is said, threatened to resign if the company helped in filling up Commercial Street again with the sports. What were the sports? Well, houses of prostitution, etc., the other things we've mentioned. He threatened to resign, right? But he didn't. Okay, back to the Journal of George Buchanan, August 7th, 1897 entry. There was a meeting of the Brigham Young Trust Company this morning at 9:30. A proposition had been made by N.W. Clayton to give 800 shares of the stock of the company, which he and his brother owned, for a piece of property on Commercial Street. So they want to buy some property on Commercial Street for 800 shares of stock. Not sure how much they are per share. All right, Cannon continues. It is a property that has been rented by people who have used the place for immoral purposes. Prostitution, right? So Cannon knows all this, as well as all the other people, the officers and directors and trustees and everybody. They all know. Considerable has been said one way and another about this, and my name has been dragged before the public as a party to it, I being president of this company. And above, this is not George Buchanan, just a president of maybe a similar company at the similar time. All right, Cannon continues, same entry, August 7th, 1897. I have felt for a long time that this place ought to be sold if we could sell it. The matter was discussed today. There were 6 trustees present, and in order to try the sense of the meeting, a motion was made that the property be sold to Nephi W. Clayton, pictured above. As the vote was a tie, I threw my vote in favor of the sale. All right, we go to another entry in his journal, March 26, 1898. I, George Buchanan, had contracted heavy debts to buy the stock as long as I had any credit or any means to do it with, and was now paying interest on over $40,000 that I had put into the Brigham Young Trust Company. That's a lot of money he put in. That would be worth $1.5 million today. So he is heavily invested in this. But he wanted to keep it from falling into the hands of strangers, that I had been paying interest on this money for years, and it had led to a very serious embarrassment for me. I guess financial embarrassment and also immoral embarrassment, right? And here's a little juicy nugget. May 23 and May 24th, 1899 entry. I, George Q. Cannon, am the largest stockholder in the Brigham Young Trust Company, at least here in 1899. All right, back to Quinn and same-sex dynamics. Also some information from Anthon H. Lund's diary, April 8, 1897 entry. At a meeting in the Salt Lake Temple 4 months later, the First Presidency and the Apostles discussed Brigham Young Jr.'s resignation and the matter of the Brigham Young Trust Company having fitted up a first-class whorehouse, and President George Q. Cannon, being the president of the company, was brought up. All right, Anthon H. Lund, April 8, 1897 entry. And that is Brigham Young Jr. pictured above. President Cannon said that he was not aware of such rumors that the church was running a first-class whorehouse. No, that's a lie. And that he had never given his consent to such a proceeding. It was said that Brigham Young had resigned, Brigham Young Jr. had resigned being a director on that account. All right, so this is Cannon basically making excuses. Same diary in Lund's diary. Brother Cannon thought that he had made a mistake in doing so, as he could have fought such an evil better in the board than outside of it. All right, let's go back to Jeffrey Nichols. Ada Wilson, a madam who had a plush New Palace brothel, which had opened a few months before in a Brigham Young Trust Company building on Commercial Street. All right, Nichols continues. The city attorney, who was William McKay, claimed to have received an invitation to a grand opening ball, but despite his complaints to the board, the house was still running. House of Prostitution. McKay claimed the only change made in the palace's debut was the transformation of the grand opening ball into a reception. All right, Nichols continues. The Apostle Heber J. Grant and other high-ranking LDS officials also received Ada Wilson's invitations to her opening ball. All right, sounds like the Apostle Heber J. Grant is making up excuses here too. April 8, 1897 entry in Anthon H. Lund's diary. Grant is going to blame it on Andrew C. Brixon, an agent of the company. So brother or Apostle Heber J. Grant said that he had charged Mr. Andrew C. Brixon, the agent of the company, with having fitted up such a company of lewd women, or rather a palace for such, and Brixon had not denied it. So it's all Brixon's fault, right? All right, same entry here in Lund's diary. When it was ready, Heber J. Grant got an invitation, and so did many others, to come and attend the reception from 8 p.m. until 4 a.m. Yeah, the general authority is going to be hanging out in there until 4 a.m., right? Many were astonished to find that they had been in a regular whorehouse. This is all the language of Lund here in his diary. Ada Wilson reportedly spent $15,000 to fit out the building as a brothel. This would be $500,000 in today's money, so a significant investment in the building owned by the church. All right, another source pointed out by Nichols. Warren Foster scolded the LDS Salt Lake Stake President Angus Cannon, pictured above, for ignoring the Wilson brothel. It's like, we should do more to stop this, right? All right, so that source talking about Angus Cannon is actually in the Mormon Monster book. I couldn't find the original source, but it is in here, the Folk and Lofton Mormon Monster book, which came out in 1900. Warren continued, you could lay your finger on high priests, 70s, and elders who are to be found in gaming halls, gambling, I guess, who lease their premises for houses of ill fame and for saloons. All right, this is pretty interesting. This is same source here. When the 21 members of your stake arranged to furnish a grand brothel on Commercial Street, we never heard your protest. So who's helping to set this thing up and furnish it? 21 members of Angus Cannon's stake. All right, same source here. When Ada Wilson sent out her beautiful circulars, I guess of the highest quality, her circulars of invitation to the young men of Zion to come to her gilded palace of vice, where were you, Mr. Angus Cannon? Sending them out to the young men of Zion. All right, this statement's pretty good from Jeffrey Nichols. Wilson, the madam who was running this palace, knew that her prominent landlords, Brigham Young Trust Company, prominent landlords, she knew that they would protect her from sporadic reform efforts because they had a lot of power and influence in reforming or stopping prostitution, right? And indeed, her house ran openly for the next decade. All right, back to Quinn. At another apostolic meeting at the Salt Lake Temple in 1900, the Apostle Brigham Young Jr. recorded that there was much talk about Brigham Young Trust Company running a whorehouse on Commercial Street. President George Q. Cannon, president, Brigham Young Jr. vice president, with Joseph F. Smith, director, on the Brigham Young board. All right, Quinn again, same-sex dynamics, and also Brigham Young Jr.'s diary, June 7, 1900 entry. The consensus of the LDS First Presidency and the apostles in 1900 was that we all disapprove of it. Young expressed himself as determined to get out of it, and the two members of the First Presidency and the 12's president resigned as trustees by 1901. All right, so the members of the First Presidency and the apostles resigned. I guess this includes George Q. Cannon. But what actually happened in the church? Did they divest themselves of these financial interests? No. In fact, the LDS Church Holding Company leased more buildings to prostitutes. They leased more of them. And the arrest records indicate that some male prostitutes lived and worked in these houses as well. And that's kind of what Quinn's book is about, right? Same-sex dynamics. Okay, Quinn continues. The LDS Church's connection with houses of prostitution remained an uncomfortable secret until 1908, when the Salt Lake Tribune proclaimed that the Brigham Young Trust Company filled these houses on Commercial Street. All right, Quinn continues. This article in the Salt Lake Tribune noted that the church-owned Clayton Investment Company, church-owned, and which continued from the Brigham Young Trust Company, continued to lease these houses of prostitution, and that the LDS Church's annual rent was $2,400 from just one of these brothel leases, which is a lot of money. Okay, at that time, $2,300 was the purchase price for a 12-room modern house, 3 blocks from the temple. 12 rooms. That's like a mansion. All right, so I think this is the article that Quinn's talking about. Salt Lake Tribune, September 26, 1908, page 14. Pages from the History of Zion. Something about the Brigham Young Trust Company and its stockholders. Trust owned property in the Tenderloin of Zion. Buildings of company rented by the officers for immoral purposes. So it's got like 4 titles. All right, the article continues. The Brigham Young Trust Company filled these houses on Commercial Street. That's what Quinn said. One house on the street was held up for $200 per month, $2,400 per year. And Quinn pointed that out. All to the tithing barrel. In the 12 years that this building has been occupied, the stockholders have received in tithes from this one house alone the sum of $3,000, which the scarlet women of Salt Lake have been held up for, the prostitutes. Okay, Mark U. This is only from one house, and the Clayton Investment Company, which took over the holdings of the Brigham Young Trust Company, knows this statement to be true. All right, the Tribune continues. It is nothing new for the stockholders to accept money from scarlet women. During the time the band held sway in city affairs, Kate Flint, who reigned as queen of the red light district, stood in with the band. Stood in with the church. All right, Kate paid her tithing. So did the white slaves whom she owned. There was never a move then by the sheriff or the county attorneys or by the police. Never a move. The band needed the money, I guess the church. Okay, Salt Lake Tribune, 1908. And Kate was in the open, too, not on Commercial Street, but on East 2nd South, between Main and State Streets, and the red light district on West South Temple Street, known as the Cave. All these help those on the underground. These things help those on the underground. Who is the underground? Polygamous leaders in hiding. Money from the brothels were going to help them. Okay, the Tribune continues. It was criminal aiding criminal, but not a peep from the organ of the Lord, the Deseret News. They were silent. Not a peep from the officials. It was money that they needed for the tithing barrel. Okay, tainted money is as welcome to the stockholders as that from the most devout Clayton Investment Company now at this point. It enables the band to live in luxury while the poor dupes suffer. So long as the lecherous gang who own, control, and dictate the policy of the Deseret News dominated Salt Lake, there was never a whimper regarding the red light. Yeah, probably not a whole lot about it in the Deseret News, although there was some. All right, that gang imported scarlet women into Zion. One of its agents served a term in the penitentiary for bringing white slaves into Utah. Are they talking about Hampton, maybe? All right, the Tribune, 1908. The queen, who was Kate Flint, whom the band of stockholders employed to run their dives, is presumed to be resting in the city cemetery, where she was buried after being slaughtered. So they're saying that Kate got murdered. Dead women, like dead men, tell no tales. Okay, this is history. It has never been denied. The records of the territorial courts tell the story. The files of the Tribune give the details. The band of stockholders instituted prostitution in Salt Lake. The band took the blood money, and it takes it today. All right, back to Quinn. Although the LDS Church was technically and legally only the leaser of the buildings, some general authorities regarded the church's leadership as morally implicated in brothel management. Not a good look for a church. All right, Quinn continues. As church president, after 1918, Heber G. Grant did not require the church's Clayton Investment Company to change things. Commercial Street ceased to be a prostitution district in 1908, but the LDS Church continued to lease the relocated houses of prostitution. Wow. All right, Quinn again, and using J. Reuben Clark's diary from 1941. He says, the Clayton LDS Holding Company did not divest its houses of prostitution until 1941, when its president told First Presidency counselor J. Reuben Clark that the church still has whorehouses on Clayton Investment. So all in all, the church owned, you could say owned, or at least rented houses of prostitution for 50 years. All right, historian Jeffrey D. Nichols basically says the same thing. This is an article he did. Polygamy and Prostitution, Comparative Morality in Salt Lake City, 1847-1911. Journal of Mormon History, 2001. So Nichols says, the Brigham Young Trust Company and its successor, The Clayton Investment Company owned commercial street properties used for prostitution until 1941. Quinn said they were relocated to some other street by that time. Hostile Gentiles sometimes raised the fact during periods of religious antagonism. So yeah, Salt Lake Tribune raised the fact, says, yep, for this 50 years, you guys had rented properties to houses of prostitution. All right, back to Quinn. Also, J. Reuben Clark's diary. Because Clayton Investment was merging with a higher profile Zion Securities Corporation, J. Reuben Clark ordered the Clayton leadership to clean or close all Clayton investment houses of shoddy character. And we know what those were. All right, Quinn continues. However, the First Presidency had declined to accept the loss of the revenues from its leased houses of prostitution throughout the presidencies of Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, Joseph F. Smith, and most of the presidency of Heber J. Grant. They those revenues. All right, Quinn continues. In all, 4 general authorities of the LDS Church were officers or directors of the 2 LDS holding companies, while they leased houses of prostitution. We've gone over most of those. All right, Quinn. In addition, the First Presidency's financial secretaries were also board members during those years. All right, I have a couple slides here that show that money would be transferred between the Brigham Young Trust Company and the regular church's accounts. A lot of money would be transferred back and forth for different things. This is from the diaries of Heber J. Grant, 1880 to 1945, a January 16, 1894 entry. On the motion of President George Q. Cannon, it was decided that the church pay $25,000 to the Brigham Young Trust Company. So there you go right there. Money going back and forth. And $25,000 is a lot of money, because I know apologists will bring this up. Say, well, it really wasn't a church company. Well, in a lot of ways, it really was. So they decided that the church pay $25,000 to the Brigham Young Trust Company so that they would be able to make a loan to the church for 2 years, and then this money could be loaned to the Friends of Hardy to protect his credit. And I won't get into all the stuff about Hardy. The church also hid assets in the Brigham Young Trust Company when the U.S. government started seizing church assets due to polygamy. The church would hide money in that company. Okay, here's another example of this from the Mormon historian Ronald W. Walker, Crisis in Zion, Heber J. Grant, and the Panic of 1893. Economic Panic, I guess. Sunstone Magazine, May 1985. The crisis was twofold: Mormon banks' waning reserves and the C.G. and Company's past due $20,000 debt to McCormick. The church provided brief thumb-in-the-dike relief for the former by borrowing $25,000 from the Brigham Young Trust Company and lending the sum to the state bank. Okay, also from the diaries of Heber J. Grant, 1897 entry. Had a long chat with brother or apostle and in the First Presidency, Joseph F. Smith, who is also a trustee and director of the Brigham Young Trust Company. Had a long talk with him, Joseph F. Smith, regarding the manner in which Saltaire was conducted, selling liquor at Saltaire, and the renting of the Brigham Young Trust Company building on Commercial Street for immoral purposes, prostitution. Long chat. All right, the diaries of Heber J. Grant again, 1897 entry. I express my opinion in plain English regarding the Sunday liquor selling at Saltaire and the use of the Brigham Young Trust Company building for any such purpose as prostitution. So he's only concerned about selling it on Sunday. I guess every other day of the week they're going to pocket the profits from selling liquor at Saltaire. And here's what the old Saltaire used to look like, and it was also on the previous slide. It's pretty fancy. All right, same diary, Heber J. Grant. Brother Joseph F. Smith acquiesced in all that I said, and I certainly hope that good may result from our conversation and that eventually liquor selling will be a thing of the past at Saltaire. All right, moving on from the Brigham Young Trust Company, let's go to another issue. We're just going to talk about Salt Lake City and prostitution in general, and then talk about the Stockade, which we'll get to. This is from Alexander and Allen again. By 1908, the American Party administration had worked out an extra legal system of registration under which each madam turned in a list of her girls, and each was expected to pay a fine of $10 per prostitute per month. So a lot of money going into the city. The American Party, as I understand it, was an anti-Mormon party. So from here on out, there's not the same kind of influence from the Mormon Church, you could say, in these issues. All right, let's go to John S. McCormick. He put out an article in 1982 called Red Lights in Zion, Salt Lake City Stockade, 1908 to 1911. We'll get to that. Utah Historical Quarterly. He says, throughout the United States, leading citizens commonly owned land and buildings in red light districts, and that was also the case in Salt Lake. So this is going on throughout all the United States. We've gone over this with the Brigham Young Trust Company, etc. Okay, McCormick continues. In many places, the money derived in this way became an important part of the city's revenue, so that in fact the aim of anti-prostitution ordinances and periodic arrests and fines was not so much to suppress prostitution as to produce revenue for the city. So revenue for the city, more money for the city, this kind of indirectly helps the church as well. All right, McCormick continues. Utah Historical Quarterly, 1982. In Wichita, Kansas, for example, the city treasurer reported at the end of August 1873 that the city income from fining prostitutes was so large that general business taxes were unnecessary. All right, same source here, Red Lights in Zion. The madams in turn gave up-to-date lists of their girls to police. Every month, each woman was expected to pay a fine of $10. The Deseret News examined the book in which the list of prostitutes was recorded and found that during the summer of 1908, an average of 148 women paid fines each month. So a lot of money. Okay, the nearly $1,500 collected monthly went into the city's general fund at Salt Lake City. In the mid-1910s, city policy was to license brothels as rooming houses and require prostitutes to work only in them. That's what the Stockade is, which we'll get to. All right, back to Mormons and Gentiles book. The chief of police, Thomas D. Pitt, recommended in 1907 that the city move the red light district from the commercial street and establish a regulated vice district elsewhere. All right, Salt Lake City Mayor Bransford accepted Pitt's recommendation, as did several American Party councilmen, I guess people on the city council, including Louis D. Martin and Martin E. Mulvey, who owned a saloon on Commercial Street. Okay, going on to another source, historian Michael Rudder, Boudoirs to Brothels, The Intimate World of Wild West Women, 2014. He talks about the Stockade in there. It's pictured above when they were constructing it. It's quite a project and cost a lot of money to construct, and we'll get to what's in there on other slides. But in December 1908, Salt Lake City law enforcement gave notice. All body girls, prostitutes, and madams have until 4 a.m. They have until 4 a.m. to turn off their red lights or else. Purveyors of flesh, you have 3 options: leave town, go to jail, or relocate to the new Stockade. All right, same source, Michael Rudder, 2014 book. The Stockade was a city-sanctioned whore block in downtown Salt Lake City, Block 64 to be precise. It was located at 1st and 2nd South and 5th and 6th West Streets. And there's another picture of it right there. All right, another source, journalist Christy Carras, More Than Petticoats, Remarkable Utah Women, 2010. She says, despite opposition, the city and a group of investors, the innocuous-sounding Citizens Investment Company, bought up land in a block, which we already mentioned where it was. This was just west of downtown, now the site of a shopping mall called the Gateway. So where the Gateway Mall is now, there was this big house of prostitution that was basically legalized and regulated by the Salt Lake City. All right, back to Rudder. He says all prostitution would be confined to this singular location. Here's kind of a map of what it looked like. The red areas there are called cribs, little 8x8 rooms where the prostitutes would work. The purple are brothel houses, so I guess those are bigger. The blue is the office, and the brown is saloons, billiards, and stores. You know, it was an ecosystem. All right, back to Alexander and Allen. The city mayor Bransford owned property across from the entrance of the Stockade on 2nd South, so that would help him and his property. All right, same source, BYU professors Thomas G. Alexander and James B. Allen. As far as I know, this is the only BYU professors to ever even talk about this issue. The city divided in a bitter controversy over the district. The American Party's Tribune and Telegram supported what became known as the Stockade, while the Mormon Deseret News, the Republican Intermountain Republican, and the Democratic Salt Lake Herald all opposed it. All right, same source. Latter-day Saint leadership allowed comment in the News, Republican, and Herald to reflect their opposition. So supposedly the LDS Church was opposed to this. All right, back to Rudder, Boudoirs to Brothels book. This block of sin, as it was sometimes called, would be run by none other than the infamous madam and businesswoman from Ogden, Utah, Miss Dora B. Topham, a.k.a. Madam Belle London. And here's another map with some labels on things if you want to pause and look at that. Okay, Rudder continues. Dora Topham, pictured above, was a successful madam, rich in her own right, who controlled Electric Alley and 2-Bit Street in Ogden, and a dozen other businesses and whorehouses in Ogden, north of Salt Lake City. All right, same source. To manage their radical experiment, the conservative Mormon town fathers wanted someone with experience, both literally and figuratively. Pictured above is a picture of the Stockade from the outside, the north entrance in 1911. Apparently, Topham's office can be seen in this. Okay, same source here. In order to clean up their fair city, Mayor Bransford and the Salt Lake City Council decided that it would be wise to put all of their rotten body eggs in one basket. And there's a picture of the American Party mayor of Salt Lake City, John S. Bransford, apparently anti-Mormon. And back to Carras. John Bransford was mayor of Salt Lake City when Madam Belle London ran the city's experiment in government-sanctioned prostitution. So I'm wondering how bad this hurt the church's businesses and houses of prostitution on Commercial Street. All right, the plan was to get rid of all the pockets of prostitution, the brothels, the streetwalkers, the lewd antics, and the doorstep exhibitionists in one fell swoop. All right, back to Rudder. Mayor Bransford said that I propose to take these women from the business section of the city and put them in a district which will be one of the best, if not the very best, regulated districts in the country. And this is a fairly recent picture of part of the Stockade. I think there's only a few buildings left. All right, here's a cover of historian Michael Rudder's book. In other words, isolate prostitution in one location, control it, tax it, and contain it. The out of sight, out of mind philosophy, but don't forget to pay your fees to the city hall. Okay, same source. This wasn't the first time that Salt Lake City had tried to sweep the flesh trade from the so-called City of the Saints. No previous attempts had been successful, but many agreed that confining prostitution in a stockade might work. All right, lewd girls would be able to go off-site and live if they wanted to. I think there was some homes on-site too, but they could only do business within the compound. And who was best qualified to run a morally corrupt business? Well, probably Topham, right? An honest man, certainly not. It could only be managed by a fallen, morally corrupt woman, yet someone that they could trust. All right, this woman would have to have good business sense, a proven track record, a disregard for decent morality, and a willingness to answer to the mayor and city council. All right, Rutter continues. After examining her unwritten curriculum vitae, is that how you say that? Dora Topham was the mayor's woman, or madam as the case might be. It didn't hurt her portfolio either, that she was wealthy enough not to need the job and could buy or sell nearly anyone of the town council. All right, this particular woman, Madam Dora, pictured above, happened to be worth more than $500,000, a very hefty sum in her day. She's competing with George Buchanan. All right, more important to Dora, she figured that this gig could make her a lot more money. It was like a legal monopoly, so she dealt herself in. All right, before the Stockade proposal, city fathers and businessmen noticed that property values near the red light district were deteriorating. Furthermore, it was embarrassing that a predominantly Mormon community should have prostitution so boldly displayed near the downtown area. Some streetwalkers were too bold. All right, these prostitutes solicited honest men who were walking with their families. Such immoral behavior could not be tolerated. It was a violation of moral decency. Okay, because the business was so frowned upon, the agreement between a conservative Mormon mayor and a whoremonger Madam Dora B. Topham remains as one of the strangest business deals in Great Basin history. So I guess Bransford was a Mormon, but he was with the anti-Mormon party. Okay, with the support of the city council and 50 successful businessmen, the mayor brought Dora to Salt Lake. One councilman was L.D. Martin, pictured above. He was the architect for the Stockade. Another councilman was Martin E. Mulvey, who helped to plan the Stockade. Okay, so Dora formed a corporation called the Citizens Investment Company and raised several $100,000. There's a plaque of this somewhere in Salt Lake. I think you can pause this and read that if you want. All right, Rutter continues. Under Dora's organization, the company issued 2,500 shares of stock at $100 a share and gave the Salt Lake Security and Trust Company a trust deed to insure the bonds. So if you take 2,500 shares times $100 a share, it's $250,000, which would be $8.5 million in 2024 today. So this was a big investment for the time. Okay, the bond issue of the Citizens Investment Company was for $200,000. Salt Lake Herald Republican. You can see the article here. Adjusted for inflation, this would be $6.7 million in 2024. All right, Rutter continues. Dora owned 1,260 shares and controlled another 1,200 as trustee. It was rumored that she said that I risk my money. The mayor risks his re-election. So Dora owned most of this company and most of this Stockade, it sounds like. And that's what Nichols also says. Okay, some information from the Intermountain Republican newspaper. Not words, but deeds, May 21st, 1909. Indeed, that foul enterprise, the Stockade, would never have been started but for the perfect guarantee of non-interference by the city. Not a man who put in money would have taken chances without assurances of help from the city. Probably true. All right, back to Christy Carras. Dora Topham provided a significant portion of the upfront costs. Reportedly, she put in $20,000 towards the venture, which was the Stockade. All right, Christy Carras again. That's Dora Topham, had already shown herself to be adept at working with local politicians and police. Money was coming from investors as well as government coffers. But I think most of the money came from her. Okay, to help avoid legal as well as financial liability, she and her partner set up a separate company that technically owned the Stockade. All right, by 1909, as many as 170 women were working at the Stockade at any given time. Dora was taking in significant cash in payments for rent, which she collected daily. She would get royalties and markups on items such as liquor. There's that whole ecosystem. Okay, her ability to stay in business is also evidence of her close working relationship with the male politicians of her time. So she was a good businessman. All right, back to Rudder. There would be 100 brick cribs that would be each 10 feet square. I've also heard the number 150 cribs. I've also heard that it was like 8 by 8 feet square each crib. Inside each crib would be a window and a door and an enamel bed, a nightstand with a wash basin, and a chair. Okay, parlor house rent started at $175 a month. Drinking establishments were another important revenue stream. In addition to the main doors, there were also secret doors for important people who wanted to visit anonymously. A lot of independent women and madams would have nothing to do with her, something that she had not planned for. Even with threats and strong-arm tactics by law enforcement, recruits were hard won. Understandably, successful businesses, especially if they owned their own properties or liked their locations, were reluctant to move. Okay, from 1908 to 1911, the Stockade was busy. Dora's office was located off the north entrance. The inmates of the Stockade were a mixed racial group. There were eating places, tobacco shops, saloons, and a dance floor. Each girl was charged rent by the day, and beer was $1 a bottle for beer. According to the annual reports of officers of Salt Lake City, prostitution arrests dropped from a little over 1,000 a year to only a handful. So we're basically legal here with a lot of regulation. All right, the police did raid from time to time to keep the public happy or to investigate complaints, but their efforts were perfunctory. Unless a crime was committed, the law enforcement machine of Salt Lake City mostly ignored the giant brick bordello. All right, public sympathy was quickly eroding. The citizens demanded closure. While the Salt Lake Police did not respond to public demand, the Salt Lake County Sheriff did. The Sheriff's Office openly crusaded against her. Okay, more public outcry was heard. The public and legal pressure culminated in charges against Dora B. Topham for soliciting and corrupting a minor who was named Dogney, corrupting Dogney's morals, an underage client that she got in trouble for. All right, not surprisingly, Dora was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Later, the Utah Supreme Court reversed the decision of the lower court. So Dora was free, but the incident had soured her on the Stockade, Salt Lake City, and its municipal government. She was soured. All right, washing her hands of the experiment, she proclaimed that on September 28, 1911, the Stockade would be closed. Now remember, the church owned buildings which were renting to houses of prostitution long after this, up until, like 1941. All right, Michael Rudder continues here. Dora returned to Ogden. The people of Salt Lake had won. Not long after she closed the brick house down, the city destroyed the building. It was as if raising the block would show the world that it had never been there. And it was a big investment to build it, and then, boom, just destroy it. All right, soured on Utah, she liquidated her businesses and moved to California. She continued raising her family and setting up other businesses. Also, she died in 1925. All right, back to Alexander and Alan. In 1938, there were at least 16 houses of prostitution in Salt Lake City. So about three years before the church stopped renting to houses of prostitution, 16 houses of prostitution. How many of those buildings the church owned, we don't know. These houses were making payoffs to the local police, they also say. And that's going to do it. We're a little bit short of 2 hours. Hope you enjoyed this. I found a lot of new information in here that I thought was pretty scandalous. So hopefully a lot of people will watch this. But that's going to do it for this video, and I thank you for watching the Mormon Church's Houses of Prostitution, 1885 to 1941 video.